Welcome. Today on Hecho in América, we'll be talking about the Women's March on Washington. As the whole world knows by now, on January 21st, the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump as President of the United States, more than 1 million people came out in the nation's capital to march. More than 2 million people marched in demonstrations across the world. Rompeviento TV was there. Let's look at some footage from the historic march.
¡Sí se puede! ¡Sí se puede! ¡Sí se puede!
March with the women and dance all night long. Hey! Hot dogs and applesauce. What's that? Hot dogs and applesauce. Hot dogs and applesauce.
The march organizers have announced that mobilization will continue against the Trump presidency. To talk about the march and what comes next, we're very privileged to have with us today Charlotte Bunch. Charlotte is the founding director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University in New Jersey and professor in Women's and Gender Studies. She's also one of the organizers of the Global Campaign for Women's Human Rights that gained UN recognition that women's rights are human rights in 1992. It's especially an honor for me to welcome Charlotte Bunch, as her writings and her organizing have formed a big part of my feminist education. Charlotte, thanks so much for being with us here on Hecho en América.
Good to be here. Thank you.
You know, I think all of us who were there on Saturday at the Women's March on Washington felt like we were experiencing an unprecedented event. 1 million people called together by women to march against an incoming president. What do you think this march showed us?
Well, I think it showed us that many more women are concerned about the current backlash against women's rights and human rights than we had imagined. And for that, it was really encouraging. I think it also showed us that many more people are ready to see a more activist movement again. I felt I hadn't seen anything like this since the 1970s in the United States. And it was really a very exciting moment, because I think it's not only in the U.S. To me, the reason that women were marching in other countries is that we've been seeing right-wing backlash in Brazil, in the Brexit vote in the UK and other countries in Europe. And so there was a sense that women are sort of realizing that we have to stand up to this in a much more active way, particularly young women. And I think that's what excited me about the march, is how many young women were there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to get back and talk a little more in depth about the international aspects of the march, and especially related to our region of Latin America. But there were also a lot of men and children in that march. How do you think they managed to go beyond and reach out to other sectors? I was so moved at times by hearing men chant, you know, her body, her rights.
Exactly. Actually, I think this has been happening the last 5 or 6 years, and certainly in the United States, that the movement of men in support of feminism has been growing, particularly men supporting groups that work on violence against women. and men's groups starting to say, this is our responsibility. Even at the UN, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had a men's group saying no to violence against women. So I think this march marked a lot of turning points, but one of them was men really understanding that the issues of women's rights, and particularly the issue of violence against women, are their responsibility, and feeling welcome. I think the women's movement has changed its tone so that men feel more like they are a part of this movement, and I think that's been going on for a while, but this is the first large manifestation of that we've seen. I also think it was a manifestation of the kinds of coalitions that women of color have been bringing into the movement in the U.S. with the insistence on intersectionality, on race, class, and gender being seen as connected. So we also had an unprecedented number of women of color speaking, taking leadership in the march. And I think that's also been a way that has involved more men, because they've been more clear that the men of their common oppressions have to be a part of the women's movement. So there were many milestones in that march.
Yeah. Well, of course, part of the reason it was so big was the confluence, too, of the rejection of President now, Donald Trump, who in many ways embodies that backlash. And not just a backlash against women's rights, but against union rights, against, with an openly racist tone and everything. Do you see those movements coming together now as a result of this kind of imminent threat?
I do. In fact, I think they've been coming together throughout this election campaign as the racist tone and the anti-immigrant tone became stronger and stronger with Trump. And it's also exposed a lot of the right-wing Republican rhetoric that's been going on that was a little bit less clear, and Trump has sort of escalated that rhetoric. So if you look at the Black Lives Matter over the last year, there have been more and more people who aren't Black joining in those marches, and understanding that what was happening to Black people was important for all of us. And I think that's had an impact, that the sense that this is a time for coalition. And I think that was visible in this march also, that it isn't just about a limited number of what we used to call women's issues. Now, I think many of us rejected that label, women's issues, years ago, and said all issues were women's issues. I remember talking about the budget as a women's issue 25 years ago, but it's reached a kind of mass consciousness that I think is unprecedented, that these issues are all interconnected. And Trump being so awful, I think, has galvanized everybody to realize that none of us expected him to be elected. So it's like all of a sudden is not only Trump, but the Republican Party has control of all the branches of government in the United States. And that's pretty frightening.
So we had a march of many sectors that was brought together in large part by Donald Trump, but under women's leadership. Women called the march. And in fact, Pussy Power was one of the main chants, the signs, the hats. It was a big part of the march. How would you define Pussy Power? Is this something that just came up because of Donald Trump's comment about grabbing pussy and the outrage in response? Or do you think it has any kind of deeper meaning?
That's an interesting question. I would say it's mostly grabbing the term and in the way that we often do in movements that is being used to denigrate us and saying, women are powerful. So you want to call us pussies? Well, pussies vote, pussies will demand, pussies will organize, and just trying to inject a little humor. I have to admit, like a lot of people, in the beginning, I was a little sort of cynical about the pink hats. I thought, oh, this is too much. But, on my way to the march, somebody offered me a pink hat, and when I got there, I wore it, and I kind of liked the fact that we had not only taken over pussy power, but taken on a symbol that really isn't normally seen as feminist. So, a pink hat, a pussy hat, and said, we don't really care what you call us. We're going to show you that we're powerful. And I also think it's a very important. You said earlier that women called for this march, and in fact, it may be known in parts of the world, but that it was really women who first called for the Black Lives Matter marches. And I think this is a kind of new moment when women's leadership of social movements that are not only about women, but that are about broader human rights issues, is really accepted as a voice of feminism. To me, what was amazing was that it was the manifesto, the demand of the marches, very explicitly feminist, and all these people came. So it was not only women, but Pussy Power was like, yes, we are feminist and we are ready to show you what kind of power we're going to have, and kind of we don't care what you call us, it's not going to stop us from moving.
A very powerful statement.
Yeah.
We saw more than 1 million people in Washington, D.C., but there were more than 2 million in marches throughout not just the United States, but throughout the world, which is an outstanding number. How do you think that caught on in that way? So to the place where we saw marches in Nairobi, marches in places that one might not ever have believed possible in a coordinated event like this.
Well, I think what's interesting is that the organizers of the event didn't call for women marching in other parts of the world. And so for me, it was even more significant because it was a spontaneous international solidarity action. It was a sense that women in many places, particularly in Europe, but also I think in parts of Latin America and other regions, feel like, first of all, Donald Trump has an impact on their lives because the U.S. is so powerful, but also that this reflected the danger of right-wing backlash that they're also facing locally. And so to me, what was really unusual was an international solidarity at the initiative of women in other countries. I first saw it, maybe a month ago. I saw women responding on Facebook and saying, we're going to organize a demonstration here in Madrid. We're going to organize a demonstration here in Sydney, Australia. And then gradually in, Kenya and in Mexico City and other parts of the global South. And so it was particularly powerful because it said what the women in the U.S. are dealing with is also our problem. So we're going to be in solidarity. I don't know if there would have been as much response if we had asked them to do it. I think there was a certain kind of, we're doing what I see of as a new global feminism in which the U.S. understands itself not as leading and telling people what to do, but as one of the women in the U.S. understand themselves as one of the countries that also needs help, needs solidarity. And this is something that I know I've advocated for years, so I was particularly thrilled that so many women did march around the world and said, your problem is also our problem. And that's a really important statement.
Yeah, it's a pretty major kind of paradigm shift. We've heard that in the immigrant movement too. Where suddenly people are saying, we've got to help people in the United States. And it does change the terms of solidarity when you recognize it's not just us helping you, but we're all in this together, kind of.
Exactly. And the interesting thing, I as an old veteran of early global feminism, I think that's where we started in the late 70s and 80s. Global feminism was clearly us helping each other. But somewhere that shifted to the sort of north-south dynamic of the U.S. sort of seeing itself as exceptional. And I think that's now shifted back, and that's a really important recognition. Even the slogan, women's rights are human rights, which came out of the global feminist movement that many of us were a part of. Hillary Clinton made it famous, but it didn't come from her. It came out of 1980s global feminism and the Nairobi to Beijing World Conferences on Women. The fact that a U.S. group adopted that slogan, which comes from the global movement, even though some of them didn't know that, shows us that I think the U.S. women's movement is in a new place. And the inclusion of women of color and the inclusion of immigrant rights as a part of that, and the understanding of that intersection of issues is a really important shift in the United States that I hope will continue.
It's an exciting development. It opens up new prospects. The other notable thing about these marches, almost everywhere, was there were no violent incidents. What's the role of nonviolence in this organizing?
Well, that's an interesting point because I don't remember seeing anything from the march specifically about nonviolence, although they did say they didn't want to make it confrontational. But the mood of the march, the tone that they set out, was not a macho tone. It wasn't a tone of sort of we can out macho you. It was a very different tone, and I think that has to do with women organizing it. That the tone was we are powerful and we are here, we're in your face, but it wasn't a macho kind of confrontation that I think often leads to violence. And to me, it's amazing that there was no violence. I also think that it was so big that the police were aware that they needed to not make it violent. And so I think there was no provocation because of the women's tone, but also perhaps because there was a sense that it wasn't going to work for them to be violent to what was such a massive endeavor organized by women. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the question of tone, because we were covering the march the day before on the inauguration, and there were incidents, and it was a very different tone. And in this, you saw protest, but not the same kind of anger, and you saw a lot of kind of festivity along with it too.
Right.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
It's quite different, and I can't exactly put my finger on why, but I think it's something we'll have to look to replicate. You know, you participated as well. We were talking about the international marches and been close to movements here in our region in Latin America. Have you ever seen anything similar to this?
Well, this past year, the Ni Uno Menos marches that women have been doing from Argentina to Peru to Chile, Bolivia, I think there's about a dozen countries that were in response initially to the rape of a very violent rape and death of a woman in Argentina, but quickly spread throughout the continent with individual cases. I think it's been somewhat similar in the sense that it was very spontaneous. It was called for mostly by younger women, women who didn't necessarily have a long history in the feminist movement, and brought, I know in Peru, the one I know best, brought hundreds of thousands of people out on the street, some of them even including the new president of Peru, which sort of shocked everyone that this issue was one that had gone so mainstream so quickly. To me, it kind of indicates that there is a younger generation using the social media spontaneous kind of gatherings in a different kind of way that I think we're going to see more of as perhaps started in some cases with the movements against Wall Street and the what's the word in Spanish for the one in Madrid about the indignados, these kinds of movements. So I think there is an international flavor of demonstrations that's sort of coming from the new social media era. And the fact that those happened in Latin America, they haven't gotten as much attention in the U.S. as I think they should, and I hope somebody will explore that further. But I think they illustrate that this really is a global phenomena, and now it's a women's movement phenomena as well.
Yeah, and I've seen very few analysis, if any, about how those processes could and probably do have a common source, and something we'll be watching closely in the future. In that sense, do you think this march was a watershed, both nationally and perhaps internationally?
I certainly think it's a watershed in the U.S. I think it's probably part of a larger trend internationally, maybe not the same watershed, but along with Ni Uno Menos, along with the movements in Brazil against the legislative coup of the right wing there. I mean, if you put all of that together, I think we do have a shifting international flavor. It's clearly a watershed in the U.S. in terms of younger women's leadership, in terms of women of color being really integrated into that leadership, and in terms of numbers. Again, I think so many young women, and I teach at Rutgers University, and I see this with my students, so many young women now feel that the rights that were gained from the last 30 or 40 years are not secure. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the other thing the march showed. We know there's been backlash. We've all talked about backlash. But I think the Trump phenomena really exposed the degree to which the rights of women are not yet secure. And I think young people suddenly realize, women and men who support and just took those rights for granted, realize that they are going to have to step up and build the movement. And hopefully, from this particular event, they also realize the kind of sense of power and even joy that can have, in the sense of you don't feel isolated. So many people have been mourning this election, the way in which Trump took over from the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote. I don't think it's just about Hillary. I think it's just about the whole process of this election somehow not being what we think our democracy should be. And that has really opened the door for, I think, a new young mass movement.
It was incredible to see there in Washington, D.C., just the change of the atmosphere from a very depressed city. Of course, Washington voted a small minority for Donald Trump on Friday, to this almost euphoria of people marching together on Saturday. There's some people say that this will be just a number of factors that came together at that particular moment, kind of a flash in the pan. Do you think it will have a longer term impact then?
I hope it will. I think it will. But I think it's the work of those of us who are longer term organizers, both the young ones and the old ones, to make it be that. We have to find other actions that will grab the imagination of larger numbers of people. We have great groups and we do a lot of important work, monitoring and lobbying and so forth, but we haven't been as good in the last few years of kind of grabbing the popular imagination. So I think that's our challenge. Our challenge ahead is to not let it just be a flash in the pan, to recognize that all those people who came, women and men, from all different parts of the United States. I mean, there were also tiny little marches in Alaska, in little parts of Canada. I mean, all those people want to be engaged. So our movements have to expand our vision to really provide that place, even as we do what the hard work is of monitoring and staying on top of the actions that are taken. But we know we have a constituency out there.
Yeah, that was certainly in evidence. The actions are already coming down, fast and furious. Yes, yeah. We have the global gag rule. There's going to be the Supreme Court turn and a number of offensives against women's rights. And everybody is asking that question, what next? Can you tell us a little about what's being done, or perhaps what should be done now in this post-March period?
Well, I think several things are being done. I mean, I'm in New York City, so there's demonstrators on the streets right now in New York tonight against the threats around building the wall with Mexico. And there's demonstrations against the threats of a Muslim immigration registry. And these demonstrations, I think, are very connected to the energy of the Women's March. In the Women's March, women were urged to make sure, if they didn't already know, who their congresspeople are. There's a lot of good information they got on what they need to be protesting to their congresspeople, which appointments they need to protest. And certainly the global gag rule has been reinstated, and the opposition to that is also reinstated. We probably won't know in the way the U.S. electoral system works until 2 years from now, when we have our next round of congressional elections. how much we can move that. But I think that that's the real challenge ahead. The organizers of the march had many of the major players present. Just as an illustration, last night on MSNBC, Cecile Richards from Planned Parenthood was asked to speak, and she said, I don't want to come by myself. I want to bring somebody from the Human Rights Campaign for LGBT rights, and I want to bring someone from the immigration movement. So there were three of them, a young undocumented woman from the immigration movement, and someone from the LGBT movement, and Cecile Richards from Planned Parenthood. And so they said, we want to try as many times as possible that any of us speak to show the linkages of these issues. That was, to me, a sign of what the march stood for, that we have to come out of our silos and really make sure people understand if you've been passionate about one issue or another, you have to put your weight, if not your time, behind all of it. That's what I hope it will lead to.
Well, very important for us here south of the border to begin to build on those links. And it's been an inspirational experience to see what's happening up there. Charlotte Bunch, thank you so much for being here with us on Hecho en América.
Right. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Right. Take care. Goodbye.
And thank you to you, our viewers. Join us again on Hecho en América de Rompeviento TV.